we look at people like Epstein and I don't know, serial killers like Ted Bundy, and there's a myriad of other people. You're like, oh my God, I am disgusted with this human being. This person is the worst human being in the world. And here's the reality about this whole thing. This has been human nature, and sin has been in existence since the beginning of man. What is happening with Epstein is not a one-time occurrence. This has been happening since the beginning of time, most likely before the flood during Noah's time, when supposedly that there was like Nephilim, and there was a mixing of, obviously there was a bunch of sin after the fall of man, and then that just corrupted the earth. God wiped out the earth for a reason. They were probably doing Epstein-like stuff, but even worse, and out in the open. Back in the day. And then after the flood, of course, sin still exists, right? And the devil still exists. And so this stuff has been happening for a very long time. Child sacrifices, to Baal and Moloch, and all these. This has been happening. It's in the Bible. I mean, it's historical. You know what I mean? And so we're surprised, but you got to understand that sin is never satisfied. You think that you are impenetrable, right, to any of these types of sins, right? How can I become like Ted Bundy? Ted Bundy, if you guys don't know who Ted Bundy is, he was only accused of killing 30 women, but in fact, he probably killed over 100, maybe even hundreds of people that were never found. And the fact of the matter is that sin, it grows and it's never satisfied. And if a human being never just keeps feeding that sin, I call it the flesh monster, right? We just keep feeding that flesh monster. That monster grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and it needs more food to be able to gratify its desire. Of course, that gratification is only temporary because, they get hungrier for the next one. And I watched a Ted Bundy interview, and I can play a few clips. The Ted Bundy interview talks about how he came from a Christian family, okay? This serial killer came from an all-American, like he was all-American, I think he was a footballer or something, but he was an all-American, did well in school, like class president, like was really, really just the perfect guy. And he said that the single most common denominator for all of the people in this prison that I'm at, he was in a prison where the worst of the worst people were, okay? He said the common denominator for all of these guys is pornography. Every single one of them. It's in the FBI studies that all of them are watching pornography. And he said to James Dobson at his last interview before he died, he was executed about 3 hours later, or a few hours later, is that you start with the little porn. You start with a little more, and you start watching more deeper, disgusting things, because that's what it takes, right? You can't just, the sin never satisfies. So you start there, and then it gets worse. So all of a sudden, you're watching like violent porn, okay? And all of a sudden, you're like, oh, he said in the interview, what if I do the real thing? Maybe I'll get as satisfied. And of course, he does it in real life. He doesn't do it once. He does it twice. He keeps going. Lo and behold, you don't just wake up and kill over 100 people, okay, 100 girls. And of course, he raped and etc. All this to say, guys, is that sin is never satisfied. And it says in Proverbs 27:20, death and destruction are never satisfied, and neither are human eyes. You have to understand that you look at Epstein and you judge him, and yet when you feed that flesh monster and you just keep feeding him, you are susceptible to becoming the next Epstein or the next Ted Bundy. Because that's the way it works. You keep feeding this flesh and not listening to your morality. That's what they did. They are peak flesh, okay? They are completely consumed by their flesh. And that's what happens when you get completely consumed by your flesh. You stop thinking logically. You let the devil completely possess you and take over you. And what I'm telling you is that you are susceptible to it. You are vulnerable to this stuff, okay? Pornography is a real thing. And I'm not talking just to the men, okay? When you allow that flesh to just grow and grow and grow, you will do things that you never thought that you would. A man does not cheat on his wife. He just wakes up and is like, oh, I'm going to cheat on my wife. When you look at that homeless person who's bent over, high on fentanyl, they didn't wake up being like, oh, I'm going to become a drug addict today. Okay? It happens in little baby steps. And they just keep feeding and they keep feeding and they don't stop. Okay? They don't stop and let God change their lives. And what happens is they just completely destroy their lives. And unfortunately, they destroy lives of others. And so all this to say, listen, I'm going to play the Ted Bundy interview just to watch. You guys can skip it. But that's my message today, that you are susceptible. Okay? Don't feed that flesh. Feed your spirit. Okay? Make that animal bigger. And just keep feeding the spirit. Because then the desires of the flesh reduce. Okay, but if you feed that flesh, oh my gosh, it never ends. Okay, guys? So that's my encouragement. Here's the video.
But I've lived in prison for a long time now. And I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography. There's no question about it. The FBI's own study on serial homicide shows that the most common interest among serial killers is pornography. Those of us who have been so much influenced by violence in the media, in particular pornographic violence, are not some kinds of inherent monsters. We are your sons and we are your husbands. And we grew up in regular families, and pornography can reach out and snatch a kid out of any house today. He snatched me out of my home. They'd snatched me out of my home 20, 30 years ago. And as diligent as my parents were, and they were diligent in protecting their children, and as good a Christian home as we had, and we had a wonderful Christian home, there is no protection against the kinds of influences that are loose in the society that tolerates